Good afternoon, and welcome to the 2020 Co-op Impact Conference. We're here at the midpoint of Impact Week, and we've got a whole lot of programming coming over the next 3 days. I'm John Torres with NCBA CLUSA, and we have just a few quick reminders before we get started. Don't forget to join us this afternoon for a live town hall discussion on how cooperatives can advance DEI, taking place at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time following today's keynote address. Now, tomorrow, the international track begins with a morning programming on both Thursday and Friday, so be sure to mark your calendars. Now, over the last couple of days, the chat feature has been on fire in each session, and we encourage you to keep up the participation. Don't forget to engage with the more than 840 fellow attendees throughout the Impact Conference. The app is by far the best way to connect and share your passion for cooperatives. Now, you can use the code. It's a QR code, actually. You can use that code to pass along your contact info. You can scan it off a screen or share it via a video chat. Now, mine is on the screen right now. You can use your camera app to capture my profile information. Now, go ahead and scan it. I'll wait, go ahead. Oh, and by the way, my Twitter profile is attached, and it would be great if you could help me beat a colleague by shooting me a quick follow. Now, during today's keynote address, please use the chat to engage with fellow attendees and use the question and answer tab to submit a question for our keynote speaker. Questions will be answered during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Now that we have the housekeeping items out of the way, it's time for a real conversation. Here to get us started is the President and CEO of NCBA CLUSA, Doug O'Brien. Doug?
Thank you, JT, and welcome everyone to day 3 of the 2020 Co-op Impact Conference. We look forward to another great day of great programming and engagement with all of you. 3 years ago, after the NCBA CLUSA Board of Directors set a new strategic vision, placing co-ops more central in the conversation around building a more inclusive economy, the staff of NCBA CLUSA set out a thematic calendar to hit on the 5 key tenets of an inclusive economy: participation, sustainability, stability, growth, and equity. After featuring the other tenets in the last 2 years, we scheduled then to focus solely on equity in 2020. This focus means that the theme of the Co-op Impact Conference and our published materials, and especially the Cooperative Business Journal, would look at co-op's role in diversity, equity, and inclusion. In 2020, now we face the twin pandemics of COVID-19 and institutional racism. The brutal killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and too many others, along with the devastating disparate health impacts and economic impacts of COVID-19 on Black and Brown communities, have put into new focus the systems that result in inequality and inequity. As important community institutions, cooperatives can play a significant role in the diversity, equity, and inclusion in the community. Helping us examine this role and how co-ops can achieve progress is professor, author, and member of NCBA CLUSA's Council of Co-op Economists, Dr. Jessica Gordon Nembhard. Jessica was inducted into the Cooperative Hall of Fame in 2016 and is professor of community justice and social economic development in the Department of Africana Studies at John Jay College of Criminal Justice at City University of New York. Dr. Gordon Nembhard is also the author of one of my favorite books on cooperatives, and one of my favorite books, period, Collective Courage, A History of African-American Cooperative Economic Thought and Practice. Beyond her academic credentials, everyone who has spent time with Jessica knows that she is one of the most gracious, generous, and insightful cooperators you will ever meet. Jessica is also a mother and a grandmother. Now please welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Jessica Gordon Nembhard.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm so excited that Doug and NCBA thought I might have something to contribute to this conversation. And thanks, Doug, for starting us out, remembering the fallen, etc. I also want to start by acknowledging the original stewards of the land. I'm trying to talk as slow as Doug did, because I realize it's easier to follow that way. The original stewards of the land, the First Nations, wherever we are. And I also always start out by acknowledging my ancestors, our ancestors, those who have been enslaved, those who continue to toil without just compensation. And I stand on the shoulders of those who use solidarity, cooperative economics in the struggle for liberation. I'm talking to you today about the challenges of achieving racial equity in co-ops. And so I want to start by talking about this notion that co-ops can't be racist, because so many people, I think that our first principle is about open membership, right? We believe in and we practice democracy. We think that's enough, but co-ops exist in a racist society, especially here in the United States. We're one of the countries that constructed and perpetuated notions of racial inferiority, and that some groups were superior and those superior groups were of European heritage. We created that notion and perpetuated it to justify and strengthen our hierarchical economic system, starting out with to strengthen the slave system, and then continued on, right? We're the country that maintained chattel slavery based on African ancestry longer than any other country in the world. We then codified anti-Black racism into our political and economic system in subtle as well as overt ways for centuries. Structural and institutional racism have cumulative effects and are woven into the fabric of our society and manifest in our preferences, attitudes, psyches, and economic relationships, as well as our social and political relationships. So it's quite insidious. So given that history, that cumulative accumulation of racist, discriminatory, exclusionary actions, how do we think that co-ops would automatically be not racist just because we don't want to be or we don't think we are? We have to deliberately promote and practice racial equity. We have to deliberately unlearn racist attitudes and stereotypes. We have to deliberately view the invisibility of institutional racism. It's not good enough to be diverse. It's not even good enough to be inclusive. If you don't remember anything else from what I said today, those are my two most important things, right? It's not good enough to just be diverse, and it's not good enough to just be inclusive. We need to be more than that. We need to really talk about equity and practice equity. So I know most of you know this already, but let me just go over, what does diverse mean? Diverse means lots of representation from a variety of people with a variety of statuses, right? But if they don't have an equal voice, if they don't feel comfortable trying to make themselves heard, if they aren't equally respected, then, right, it's not good enough to just have people in the room or say you have people who are members, right? Some people want to talk about diversity as making sure that everyone's invited, right? Talk about a dance or something, right? And then inclusion is going even further, not just having people invited to the dance, but people actually participating in the dance, people being asked to dance, right? So inclusion is, you know, more action, more activities. But then that's not even enough if the activities aren't representative of everybody's culture and interests, if the activities and expectations for success are still Eurocentric, right, based on just one model about assimilation. If people are included only if they assimilate, right, then that's not real inclusion and that's not racial equity. if people are asked their opinion, but then ignored or belittled when they give it, or if there's no significant leadership roles or no influence on decision-making, right? Then inclusion is hollow, diversity doesn't matter, and we haven't achieved racial equity or racial justice. So what does equity really mean? Some people use this visual, and of course some people complain about the visual, but I'll go with this visual, right? If we've got, right, children watching a baseball game, right? The first one is sort of what the reality is, right? Some people have way extra privilege and additional privileges. Some people just can barely see over the fence, and some people are actually in a ditch. It's not even that they can't see over the fence, they're actually in the ditch. And we know who all those people are, right? Equality says, okay, let's give them all the same platform so they all have a chance at looking over the fence, right? But if you see that equality picture there, our little one still doesn't even really have a chance to see over the fence, though he's got an equal stool or an equal crate to stand on. Then equity, right, is making sure everybody can see over the fence, right? So the littlest one, the one who had been in the ditch, gets 2 crates or as many crates as he needs to actually see over, he or she needs to see over the fence. You see the way it goes. And so we get closer to inclusion, we get closer to equity. But notice a lot had to happen just to get to the equity picture, right? Very deliberate measures had to be taken, right? What might be even more equitable though, and would be to take the fence down. So that's in this picture, they call that liberation, right? No fence at all. But then if you have the fence down, that's a lot of different issues come up too, right? Why was the fence up in the first place? What are you keeping people out for? Are you keeping people out so the event could be restrictive or exclusive? Are you keeping people out because you want to charge money and you don't want the people who don't pay to be in there, right? Do you need extra security if you take the fence down, right? What does security mean, and what's the role of equity in relationship to security? And then, what if it's really about just keeping the ball inside a prescribed area so people don't have to go chasing the ball all over the place or lose balls, right? So then you still have to be deliberate and think through what is even the liberation, who's liberated, why are they liberated, how does it work, what's going to happen with that. So that's why I keep talking about how it's important to be deliberate, purposeful, and be strategic, right? It's not just enough to have good intentions. And it's also important, right? Because we don't just want tokenism. We don't just want 1 or 2 people to feel more comfortable or to feel like they've gotten equity, but not the whole group, not the community that surrounds it, right? We need to pay attention to the social relations, the power relations, the efficiency assumptions, but also the economics of it. Are we willing to do all that work? Are you willing to do all that work? How do we recognize the ways that our co-ops perpetuate institutional racism? How do we engage or not engage in racist microaggressions and exclusion? How do we check ourselves as individuals and check our organizations? Because again, it's both, right? It's not just what individuals do, it's what happens in organizations, and it's not just what happens in organizations, it's also about the people who are in the organization. So we've got to check ourselves and our organizations. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. And I want to look at the reality, right? How do we examine our own assumptions and practices and examine how our cooperatives operate and the unintentional outcomes? So I have about 6 ways that I see racism in the US cooperative movement. I'll start with these first 4 that are on this slide. The first one is about Blacks and Black, Indigenous people of color, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color. That's the new term I think a lot of us are using now, right? Missing in action in the co-op world. It's nothing near the way it was in the 1990s when I started being interested in co-ops. And when I first started attending co-op conferences, there were no Black participants, there were no Black presenters, there were no Black co-ops in residence or in case studies. right? Unless we met in the South, and then there might be 1 or 2 representatives from the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Land Assistance Fund. And that organization, I actually knew more about them from my Black economists organization than I did from starting to attend co-op meetings and co-op conferences. But they were there sometimes. So I started asking, where are the Black people? Some of the conferences and trainings were too expensive for Blacks, I found out later, but mostly the co-op community wasn't focused on attracting Blacks or welcoming Blacks. If somebody came, right, somebody of color came to a meeting or a conference, they wouldn't be turned away because, you know, as again, we're not racist, right? But we didn't make overt outreach to bringing people in. We didn't try to think about why people wouldn't feel welcomed if they came. And so we were happy with that. Now, as I said, you know, that was what, 30 years ago. We're doing much better now. So I don't want to dwell too much on what used to happen, but I do want to talk about some of the vestiges of that because that still impacts how we could achieve racial equity now. So I started raising the questions. I started asking people. I started mentioning things to people, you know, and again, first people were like, well, you're here and we have the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, you know, isn't that enough? But more and more people got interested in changing the composition of who came and who didn't. But even as I started inviting Black people to conferences and meetings and stuff, especially Black youth, they didn't feel welcome. They didn't feel like the co-op movement was really for them. They told me the costs were too high for their participation, or the issues discussed weren't relevant to what they were interested in. They felt alienated, and most of them didn't come back in the first few years. Probably because of the next 2 comments I'm going to make about the invisibility of white privilege that many co-op members exude, and no representation of Blacks in the materials and the case studies or in the concerns of the co-op movement at that time. So I'll get to those in a minute, but there was one more issue about the missing in action I wanted to bring up, which was that in the 1990s and early 2000s, the co-op movement didn't really address urban issues that much and didn't really focus on urban co-ops and worker co-ops. And so young Blacks, even middle-aged Blacks, were very interested and are very interested in revitalizing urban areas. And so again, the co-op movement didn't really seem focused on that originally, right? We had to have separate committees and meetings about urban co-op issues. It took decades to get co-ops to focus more on urban development. Now we're doing much better again with that. And now the worker co-op movement, right, has brought co-ops really to the cities beyond credit unions and housing co-ops. And so, you know, it's a different world now. But in that early world, it really is true that in some ways we weren't welcoming of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color into our movement. And again, I'm not saying we were doing this intentionally. The second way that I see racism in the co-op movement is the feeling and notions that we can't be racist, right? And that we aren't, that we don't understand or we don't think about racism as something that can happen in co-ops. I have 2 things I want to talk about under that topic. First is I was approached by a graduate student at a prominent university here in the US a couple of years ago. She wanted to do her thesis on racism in co-ops. And not one of her faculty thought that was an issue or an issue appropriate for a thesis. And so she contacted me because she knew something was wrong. And, you know, by then I had published my book on collective courage that Doug was so nice to mention already. And so we talked about it, and I talked about how she could find some allies, faculty allies who would be interested in this topic. And I reassured her that yes, race and racism were issues in co-ops. And she finally was able to find a couple of faculty members who would work with her so she could do her study. But again, it's part of this, right? Even in academia, there was this notion that, oh, co-ops are so opening and available that we don't, right? We don't have this issue. But the other issue about that co-ops can't be racist is, I think, this notion of invisible white privilege. And so I do want to just briefly talk about Peggy McIntosh's work from the 1980s. She talks about unpacking the invisible backpack of white privilege. And so I just have a few quotes from her, just so we make sure we all understand what I mean by white privilege, because I mean the same things that she means. So she talks about white privilege as an invisible backpack of unearned assets, which she can count on. She can cash in on every day, but she was meant to be oblivious to it. So it's an oblivious set of unearned assets, but give you daily returns on them, right? She said whites are carefully taught not to recognize white privilege, just like males are taught not to recognize male privilege. Co-ops don't recognize their white privilege, I argue, though I think and hope this is slowly changing. So I've got a couple of good quotes from McIntosh just about white privilege. And as I said, I think it applies to some co-ops and how people think in some co-ops. But she says, whites are taught to think of our lives as morally neutral, normative and average, and also ideal. So that when we work to benefit others, this is seen as work which will allow them to be more like us. And I think we have that problem in co-ops too, right? Mainstream co-ops think, right, the mainstream white co-op is the norm, right? And that when we have new people come in, we're supposed to assimilate to that norm, and we don't think about what that means or how that's being racist. She says, I do not see myself as a racist, I did not see myself as a racist because I was taught to recognize racism only in individual acts of meanness by members of my group, never in the invisible systems conferring unsought racial dominance on my group from birth. So again, that invisibility of it, we don't even realize sometimes that we're carrying these notions. And she says, what does white privilege feel like? You can live wherever you want. You can shop wherever you want and not be followed. You can get a loan. You can get a job. You're always treated with civility. You see yourself in the media, in advertising, and management. Or in our case, you would see yourselves in co-op histories, right? I can swear or dress in secondhand clothes or not answer letters without having people attribute these choices to the bad morals, the poverty, or illiteracy of my race. I really love that one because that's a real normative thing, right? She can do things against the norm, but not have it assumed that it's because of her race that she's doing them, right? And she says, being of the main culture, I also can criticize it freely or fairly freely. And my white privilege provides a freedom of confident action. And so hopefully, even if you've heard about this notion of white privilege, or even if you know McIntosh's work, my repeating it here, you might be able to see how it manifests itself in co-ops. And so then finally, she talks about power from unearned privilege can look like strength when it's really permission to escape or to dominate. And this obliviousness maintains the myth of meritocracy, the myth that democratic choice is equally available to all. It props up those in power and serves to keep power in the hands of the same groups that have most of it already. So I hope, as I said, that you're seeing that sometimes our co-ops suffer from this same, right, invisible baggage. And that if we don't confront it, right, we won't be welcoming enough. We won't really get past inclusion and get to racial equity. And then imagine if you combine male privilege, heterosexual privilege, ableism, intersect that with anti-Black racism. All that intersectionality is what's people who are either in co-ops or that we might want to invite into co-ops are dealing with. And so we can't even just say we're anti-racist. We have to look at the intersectional relationships between all the oppressions. And so that's why I keep saying we have to really be deliberate about trying to change, right, how we act, change how we see things, right? Stop thinking about what we do as the norm and other people as not norm, right? Or people feeling that people need to assimilate to us, whereas we need to be much more welcoming and accommodating to diversity. And we have to be proactive. So then my last piece about this sort of invisible white privilege is notions of individualism, tokenism, and invisibility. Sorry. You know, they perpetuate institutional racism. So sometimes, right, just the fact that we're being tokenist, meaning we're happy to just have one Latinx person or one Black person or one woman in leadership, and we think that's enough, and that's not enough. That's still part of the invisibility, where we think one thing or one little action is enough when we need to take multiple actions and lots of actions, right? Because we have to deal with a lot of cumulative things. We need to make sure there's not just one voice, but there's leadership, and there's not just leadership, but there's multiple voices heard, right? We need to make sure that there's lots of ways that we're bringing people in, not just accepting the people who do come in, right? Those kinds of things we have to pay attention to. And then we have to correct and transform, right, the injustices that exist, even the ones, well, especially the ones that are in our control, and even the ones that aren't. The third reason that I see racism in co-ops is when I read co-op development materials and co-op histories, right? No Black co-ops are mentioned. No Black leaders are discussed. No Black history, co-op history is included. No Latinx people, no Latinx co-ops are mentioned, et cetera. No Native Americans, no Asians. I keep looking for the mainstream co-op materials to include that. And again, we're starting to do better, but it's really slow. Right? We're told that co-op started with the Rochdale pioneers in 1844. There's no mention of the long history of economic cooperation among all peoples, especially early African societies and First Nations. We don't, you know, for years they didn't even mention Scottish and early US mutual aid and co-op societies that happened before 1844. And there was definitely no mention of like asusus and rotating savings and credit arrangements, which almost all people of African descent use and are precursors to credit exchanges and credit unions. So this universalism about mutual aid and economic cooperation, I kind of had to find that on my own and then start asserting it every time I talked about what a co-op was. Because even when I talked to African Americans about co-ops, they would say, oh, that's not part of our tradition. We don't do co-ops, and it's not true, right? African civilizations have been using cooperatives since the very beginning. Blacks, since they stepped foot, since they were brought in chains to the United States, have used co-ops. As I said, First Nations, in addition to the, you know, the notions of commonwealth and commons and that kind of thing. So just, you know, getting away from that mythology. Remember, part of that backpack is the meritocracy and the mythology of what we're doing. We perpetuate things as norms, and they're not, right? And then the other piece is, right, so where are the Black co-ops? Where is this history? And because the mainstream co-op movement hasn't, and is luckily doing better now, but hasn't connected to those issues and to that information, right? People have come in and not seen themselves, not seen their co-ops, not seen people like them. So I wrote a book, partly to answer that question of where are the Blacks, right? I did 10 to 15 years of research. I finished the book. I found sort of a history of survival, resistance, and prosperity through Black co-op ownership. And then this year, actually, Esther West asked me to help her, and she did a whole study of Latinx co-ops. So we're getting better. We're getting that information out. It needs to really be incorporated more into everything we do. And then I think I'm running out of time, but I want to do some more subtle issues of how racism is perpetuated in co-ops. The first one is about income and wealth assumptions. And sorry, I just lost my page. Oh, I know what I did. The co-op model itself creates assumptions about income contributions. I think we all know that, right? It's one of the things we love about co-ops is that we all put in equity, right? But the late Ralph Page from the Federation of Southern Cooperatives and I used to talk about this years ago, right? Cooperators are supposed to have assets that they contribute to the co-op. And in some ways, that's part of their value to the co-op, right? But what do we do about people who don't have disposable income, who don't have money to put into the co-op, especially not at the beginning? Does that mean they can't cooperate, or they're not good cooperators, or they have to be second-class cooperators, right? Or does that mean we just alienate them and they don't join? It's a problem. But, you know, the history of Black co-ops that I looked at, it wasn't a problem. Many of the Blacks who started co-ops started them because they had nothing but their ideas, their energy, and their sweat equity, and that was enough. Many of the Black co-ops let people buy their shares in installments. So you didn't have to put out all the money at once, but you could still be a member. And we now have that, especially in worker co-ops. But this notion, right, about what's equity, who brings equity, you know, privileging equity is a problem. And it's also, you know, a racist issue because, as I said, we're in a racist society where African Americans didn't even own their own bodies at one point, let alone have any accumulated wealth, and still have problems because of Jim Crow and all kinds of other discriminations, right? We still have low wealth, lowest wealth of every sector in the US, that kind of thing. So how do we, right? So how do we make sure that low income and low wealth don't leave people out? The model for successful grocery co-ops for years, right, was based on that notion about needing a white middle class because nobody else would buy organic or would know how to, you know, really use fresh produce, that kind of thing. Those assumptions, I think, are gone now, but those were, you know, really isolating and alienating to Blacks. We now actually have a caucus of Black food co-ops, right? And we're trying to figure out how to connect with Blacks and food co-ops and that kind of thing more. But the fascinating thing to me is that Black food co-ops were one of the 3 most popular co-ops that Blacks started in history, along with credit unions and ag co-ops. So how could, you know, by the late 20th century, how could Blacks feel alienated from food co-ops? It's just, you know, that kind of thing is just mind-boggling when you think about it. And then that kind of notion also helps co-ops be, especially the food co-ops, be part of the gentrification movement, right? Again, sort of unwittingly, but when land is cheaper in Black neighborhoods, and so co-ops buy or rent there and have their co-op there, but bring in white members without really connecting to the Black community, without really being welcoming to Black members, right? That's a problem, and we need to address that and be cognizant of that. So, right, the income issues, the wealth assumptions have broad implications and are a problem in general. The 5th thing I want to talk about quickly is that our co-op movement doesn't really recognize the colonizing role that cooperatives have played in North America, and I think probably in South America, Caribbean, also Central America. But enabling white settlers to take over indigenous land, an earlier version of gentrification, right? Excluding people of color and consolidating certain kinds of businesses using co-ops. We have to come to terms with that history, because without coming to terms with that history, we can't understand why co-ops would either be alienating to some people or not seen, right, as a solution, but seen as a problem in other groups, right? Again, in history, we had some Black co-ops that weren't even comfortable joining with CLUSA or going to mainstream co-op conferences for these reasons. They held their own. Many prominent Black co-op leaders were tokenized, were not supported, so sometimes they were brought out by the co-op movement to say, here, we've got Black leadership, but that nothing more was done. Their co-ops were not supported, that kind of thing. We still have some co-op laws which don't allow incarcerated or previously incarcerated people to be board members. And so we've got to look at those kinds of things. So there's still ways that we need to look and see where are the vestiges of, you know, marginalizing people and people who have been excluded, who are still excluded from our co-ops just because of the way society excludes them. And my 6th point is about siloing. Right, I have a couple issues about siloing. First, consumer and producer co-ops are not worried about their workers. I think we're getting better again with that. But in general, they're worried about their members, but not their workers. And often their workers are people of color. So this can be a huge problem, and another reason why Blacks might not see co-ops as a benefit to them if their co-ops they work for are treating them just as badly as any other employer. So we need to think about that relationship, right, between employees and co-op members, and think more about multi-stakeholder co-ops, right? And I think a couple of people have talked about that through the conference this week. Another example of siloing is in co-op education, right? Co-op education is often just something that happens inside a co-op and not connected to co-op development or connected to training generations of potential cooperators. So we have a very narrow view of co-op education. We don't think of it as a way to do outreach, to bring more people in, to make more people feel connected to the co-op movement, and to have more people understand, right, what a co-op is and how to join and start one, that kind of thing. So there's no focus on co-op education in the public schools and universities. Some of us have been trying to change that, but again, I think that's another area that the broader co-op movement that we could be arguing for this, and I think that would also help with racial equity. And then, of course, if we're going to expand our co-op education, then we've got to expand and do better with our co-op materials, right? Going back to, we've got to make sure our materials cover all the different groups that we're trying to educate about this. And I also mentioned siloing in my Hall of Fame acceptance speech in 2016, because I'm afraid that siloing is what keeps our co-op sector small and isolated as a movement, right? We don't develop co-op supply chains and interlocking co-ops. We don't use the resources from one co-op sector to support the growth and sustainability of another co-op sector. We were very slow. The movement was slow in the US to accept the US worker co-op movement and worker co-ops. And again, those are the most diverse and inclusive of all our sectors, right? We have the fewest percentage of worker co-ops in the United States. The United States has the fewest worker co-ops in all of the northern countries. We don't have strong supports for our worker co-ops still, though that's growing. And so that siloing also hurts us. And again, right now, the most diverse sector is worker co-ops. So if we don't continue to embrace worker co-ops and solidarity co-ops, we're going to lose out on that. So what do? I like to focus on solutions, even though I gave you, 25 minutes of problems. But you can't focus on solutions if you don't look at if you don't understand the problems, right? So, I'm very encouraged, right? This whole conference and the NCBA's focus on equity is really exciting and encouraging. The speeches and the presentations so far have been great. This is I've never seen so many Black and brown presenters at an NCBA conference, and usually not at any co-op conferences, except the worker co-op conferences have done better in the last 10 years on that. I'm encouraged by the US Federation of Worker Co-op conferences and practices, because they actually practice language justice. And so that's another area that I think co-ops need to go into, is think about language justice, especially Spanish at this point, right? As I said, I'm really encouraged that the US Federation of Worker Co-ops and the worker co-ops are the fastest growing co-op sectors and very, very diverse. The credit union sector is quite diverse at this point, and there's even the Association of African American Credit Unions. The housing co-op movement is pretty diverse, and I see this growing movement for for Black food co-ops. And again, that's partly because there was a concerted effort to talk about the issue of race in the food co-op development movement, and also a lot of advocacy, right, by Blacks who decided to to create a caucus of Black co-op, grocery co-ops, that kind of thing. And so that's why I keep talking about how important it is for us to be proactive and deliberate about these things, because you see change does happen when we're very deliberate and proactive about this. And I'm certainly excited because things have changed since the 1990s when I first started coming to these conferences. So what do we need to do? We need to get out of our silos, right? We need to really practice Principle 6, cooperation among cooperatives. We need to think about multi-stakeholder co-ops and not so much about, siloed co-ops so much. We need fair labor and fair trade policies. And then I learned yesterday, it's not fair trade isn't enough, right? We need fair production and processing policies and practices, and ownership and production side. And we need to practice all these new policies. We need to really practice Principle 7, concern for community. Because if we're not concerned for the surrounding community, right, then we're also not going to be welcoming. We're not going to really address institutional racism if we just stay looking inside our co-ops. So concern for community has to be a much more driving force. I heard, I think on Monday, about some are practicing a new principle, Principle 8, on diversity, inclusion, and equity. So I encourage us to also create an 8th principle. And so that's one of the first steps. So create solidarity systems. That's what I've got on the slide for you to look at closely. That's what I mean, right? Multi-stakeholders are solidarity systems, right? Looking at how we really cooperate with other cooperatives, how we really do concern for community. That's all a way to create solidarity systems, to think of co-ops not just as with the co-op principles and values, but with solidarity principles and values, which include non-exploitation, right? Non-hierarchy, grassroots participation, that kind of thing. My research in African American history found that most of the Black co-ops saw themselves as part of a solidarity system, right? They saw themselves as part of a larger movement to benefit all Blacks, or at least to benefit all their neighbors. So almost none of the co-ops that got started were just to help the members. They were to solve a community problem and help as many people as possible through a co-op system and a membership system. And so I hope that we can see, right, how benefits can be gained by being proactive about racial equity and justice, that we can actually broaden, strengthen, and enlarge our movement if we do these things. I have 2 examples of how we could do my last 2 solutions, and then I'll be finished and be ready for question and answers. So updating our co-op materials with Black, Indigenous, people of color, and people and practices and case studies, more people's histories, diversify the materials. In a minute, I'm going to show you what happened in North Carolina in the 1930s and 40s that was extremely effective with updating materials and being more inclusive in their materials. And then the second thing I think we need to do is rethink and rewrite our development strategies to address how BIPOC issues and conditions, right, affect all of us, and that what we do in co-ops is going to address all of that. And I've got an example from history on that one. So North Carolina Council was in existence. It was actually a statewide council of Black cooperators from 1945 to 1948, but its roots started in the 1930s when 2 independent Black schools started to do co-op development and to develop some co-op societies. So the BRICS, Rural Life, some of you have heard me talk about this already, and the Terrell County Training School, Black independent schools, they started doing co-op farming with the parents. They started co-op education program with the children and the parents. They did equipment co-ops, credit unions, buyers clubs, a health insurance, a health co-op as well to address. Both of those were in Eastern North Carolina. They first were operating independently of each other, but then realized what each other was doing and organized an Eastern North Carolina Association of Black Co-ops. After using that association through the rest of the 30s during the Great Depression, they realized that they would be stronger with a statewide coalition. So that's when they started the North Carolina Council. And that purpose of that statewide coalition was actually to create learning materials, manuals, and workshops that would promote and develop Black credit unions and co-ops throughout the state. And they were able to get a partnership with the state agricultural department so that when they wrote and created these manuals and designed these workshops, they would be distributed through the state agricultural department so that they could leverage the state's resources and wouldn't have to do everything themselves. The The result was growth, huge amount growth in Black credit unions and a huge growth in Black co-ops over that period. So in 1936, there were 3 Black credit unions. By 1948, 3 years after the North Carolina Council had started its program, there were 98 Black credit unions in the state of North Carolina and 48 additional Black co-ops. So you can see why I'm talking about that this is a model, right? This is Black people being proactive about what they need, but joining with a larger statewide organization that had resources, getting those resources out, getting a very proactive program going, and what are the results? A huge number of co-ops developed. And then my second example for more about how we can all, how coalitions of multiple interests and multiple kinds of organizations can matter and address issues that are important to all of us, goes back to the 1880s in Richmond, Virginia. And sorry for all of you in the West and Midwest. I'm not using examples from there, but you know there are examples all over the country. These were just really exciting to me for exactly what I'm proposing here. So in 1885, the Knights of Labor, which some of you know was a very progressive, integrated labor union that promoted not just labor rights, but also worker ownership and worker co-ops. They were an integrated union, except that in the South, the Blacks and whites weren't allowed to congregate in the same room. So you had to have separate Black and white district assemblies. But they coordinated a plan to control the city council. So they created the Working Men's Reform Party so they could run candidates for city council in 1885. They won control of the city council with some Black assembly members actually getting elected in addition to white, but all of them in this Working Men's Reform Party. The Reform Party had a platform of racial integration, unionized workforce, including women in the workforce, and supporting worker cooperatives. And they were able to put their platform in place to rebuild Richmond City Hall. Richmond City Hall had been burned down by the Union Army at the end of the Civil War. It had never been replaced. And the party that was in control of City Council before 1885 had planned to rebuild with convict labor from the state of Virginia. And that was part of what the Working Men's Reform Party was against. They didn't want to support convict labor. They wanted to make sure that labor was unionized, included women, was integrated, and hired worker co-ops. And so they were able, with their control over the city council, to actually build the city hall with the labor that we're talking about: unionized wages, integrated workers, using worker co-ops as much as possible, including women workers, et cetera. And so again, this kind of combined campaign, right? It addressed labor issues, political power issues, gender equity issues, racial equity issues, displacing of convict labor. So you can see again how all these forces important came together and actually strengthened the Knights of Labor, strengthened what they were able to do in one city, right? And then also strengthened the worker co-op movement that was fledgling at that point. So those are my examples. The last lessons for us that come out of them are: one, that community and organization matter, right? That it's so important to have strong organizations that promote the kinds of values and help to teach, right? Not just about co-ops, but teach about these kinds of issues that we care about. And also communities matter because communities are our members. Our members come from communities. Communities donate to co-ops. Communities buy from co-ops, and communities defend co-ops. And so if we don't look outside of our co-ops and make sure we're including community and strengthening community, right, we're weakening ourselves. And my final point is that I've been arguing that we really can't achieve racial justice without economic democracy and economic justice. But economic democracy and co-ops need racial equity, right? We're not going to get to economic democracy without racial equity. So in some ways, it's a cycle, but we do have to think about, right, that we've got to promote economic democracy and economic justice more. I argue that co-ops are one way to do that, but we can't do that with co-ops if we don't address the racial equity issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you so much for that presentation. It's, I think it captures so much of the conversation that that really is going across the impact agenda, this year. And there's so much to dig into. I've got all kinds of notes myself, but we really want to make sure that we have your questions in the audience. And so please use the Q&A button, probably about there, on your screen, and we'll be monitoring those, and I'll be able to present those questions to Jessica as we go along. So please take a look at that Q&A. You can also please engage in the chat feature. I've seen a lot of folks already are, which is great. Some great points in there, Jessica. I'll see if I can pull some of those up as we go along here. Just before we get to the question and answer, I do want to remind people that at 1:30 this afternoon, we are hosting a town hall and panel on how co-ops can kind of move out and act on so much of what Jessica talked about around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So please do join us at 1:30, and there's a great interactive portion there that's really important for NCBA Inclusive to hear from you. But let's get to the conversation with Jessica. Jessica, there's so much to talk about. We talked about at the top of the conference, we talked about how impact is a place for three things: inspiration, learning, and most importantly, action. And I think your comments couldn't sort of track that any more than possible. Some of the things, and we so much appreciate you bringing a clear-eyed look at how cooperatives fit into the economy, into society, into history, and we have to be clear-eyed. We have to learn to be able to to move down that next step. We have to understand where we are. So we appreciate that, and of course, I love the examples in the solutions. I'll start with a question that I have around your sort of the first theme that you talked about, and that was around deliberateness and how people need to be deliberate as they approach this work. I can tell you, I've been with NCBA Inclusive for 4 years now, and the activity in every sector across the board, there is much more activity and focus. And this is a very big tent we have in co-op world, with a lot of different geography, a lot of different cultural context, a lot of different, demography, everything. But people are starting to move down that path if they weren't already. I guess I just asked a question. For those and different steps along those paths, what's that? What are some of the first things on how to be deliberate as you kind of enter into this work to make sure that co-ops really are more effective in diversity, equity, and inclusion?
So I guess maybe two most important deliberative things. The first thing is, and people have heard me say this a lot, in the Black co-op history, most of the co-ops started with study groups, study circles, people just coming together to talk. And that also built sort of trust, collective learning, whatever. I think we probably need to get back to that, right? Call a study meet, call a conversation, right? I think partly we just need to start talking to each other, safe space to talk about these issues, to let people to raise issues. If you already have BIPOC people in your co-op, make sure you have a space where people can talk about how they're feeling, whether they feel welcome or not, what are the issues. Have a space where you can look at your own co-op's history, your own co-op's practices, trying to look at them with a clear eye and a new view. Are you doing any microaggressions? Are you, supporting any, right? And just that honest conversation. I think that goes a long way. And sometimes that's the easiest way to start in terms of you don't need really new resources. You probably need a good facilitator, but, just talk to each other. So I think that's really important. And then I am a stickler on this. Let's revise our materials, because I do think, we don't have good videos that include people of color. We don't have good Materials, again, I do have to give kudos to the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives. Almost all their materials are in Spanish and English, but most of the rest of the co-op sector doesn't do that. So, so figure out what are, again, even if it's just starting simply, what are the simple ways that our materials could be more inclusive and could be connecting better to the histories around us, the histories that we now know because some of us have done the work, right? Just include some of that in the materials. I think those two would go a long way. Obviously, after that, there's a lot more stuff that could be done, but.
Right. That's great. No, those are great examples. I'll just mention on the book club, I was reminded at the panel on local ecosystems this morning, Jamila Medley reminded me that, in Philadelphia, the activity around co-ops, worker co-ops in particular, but all kinds of co-ops has really heightened in the last few years. And she pointed to a book club that they created in 2016, and many of the leaders in the co-ops actually came out of that. And of course, in your book, Collective Courage, there's a number of examples of not only co-ops coming out of those book clubs, but actually civic leaders, civil rights leaders, and just being taking that deliberate time. So thanks for reminding us about that. So a question here from, and remember everybody, just the Q&A button. Here's a question on where do we need, of course I mentioned, and you did too, about how we are seeing some real progress, and that's very heartening. But are there some things at this moment that we need to be particularly watchful for, that we don't actually go backwards or that we become too complacent? What do we need to be clear-eyed about in this moment?
So that's where I was trying to say, I think I said at the beginning, if you only remember one thing about what I said, and I know I probably said too much and talked too long, but that diversity and inclusion are not enough. And I think sometimes we just want to celebrate, right? When we have one or two Black people, or we help support a Black co-op or whatever, it's just not enough. Just one or two little things, piecemeal. And I say, even inclusion is not enough, because inclusion doesn't often mean power, right? It just means acceptance. And so I'm talking about ways to try to understand how to change, right? How to transform the power relationships in a co-op and in the co-op movement, right? Mm-hmm. Who are the leaders? Who do they represent? Who is being listened to? Who feels comfortable, right? Mm-hmm. To make sure we're not just tokenizing people or tokenizing issues, but really, right, really digging down deep and trying to change and being willing to change, right? Because it's also really easy to say the right stuff, but not to really make real change. And so that's what I'm hoping, right? I'm trying to get us to say, it's just not good enough to say, of course, I'm not racist, or of course, anyone who wants to join can join. We have to really make it so that people feel comfortable, the power is shifted. We're very cognizant, right? Because we live in a racist society, it's really easy to be racist, but not think of yourself as being racist. And so that's where we just have to be so hyper aware of the unintended consequences of our attitudes, views, practices, and try to figure out how to really transform them and ask for help. I mean, there are people out there who know how to help people to recognize and to change. Yeah. So, be aware, ask for help, and then be willing for the power dynamics to change. Yeah,
thank you. Yeah, you talk about ask for help, and we've seen sort of in the co-op ecosystem in just this last couple of years where, whether it's the co-op development professionals, some of those in kind of the consulting ecosystem, that they're bringing on people with expertise, they're cultivating expertise. And so we are seeing more of that. And another place you mentioned this on the solutions is that, across the different sectors, people are doing different things. They're sort of approaching them at different times. And there's things to learn. The credit unions now have the DE Collective, that's really come now kind of formalized this network. And you can look at the work that the food co-ops are doing. You can look at the work, again, across sectors. But But what we want to do, I can tell you at NCBA CLUSA, is we really want to be a place where people can learn from each other, kind of meet them where they are and help them get to the next step of where they want to go. Another question here, and we got time just for a couple more, but I think this is a good one, and I think it's a tough one for me as I think about it. I'll just read it. There's strength in homogeny for oppressed people to liberate their own spaces, and there is strength in learning how we effectively integrate our spaces. What are the ways we can acknowledge both of these dynamics, both of these spaces that can add to cooperatives' work for equity and liberation?
Right, fabulous question. So when I talk to predominantly BIPOC people, Black, Indigenous people of color, I talk about that importance for internal control, right? For us in some ways to self-segregate until we can gain a position of power so that then we can integrate as equal people. And so I do believe that. I don't just say that to people. I believe it because, again, because we live in a racist society. You know, it's very hard, like that picture of the fence with equity and equality and whatever, right? If we're in that hole, right? And then everybody says, okay, well, now you can join us, but we join you as an inferior. You're doing us a favor, right? You're patronizing us. You're kind of expecting us to assimilate to you. You might be nice and give us a crate so we can get out of the hole, right? But then you're giving us stuff, right? But if we develop our stuff together through our own racial group solidarity and develop our co-op, have strength in that co-op, then when we come to integrate, we're not asking you for anything. We're coming as an equal partner. We already have a co-op. We already have some resources. We already have experience. We already have some wealth or whatever. We have leadership. We know we've asserted leadership among ourselves. And so then we can really be equal partners. And so then, today I felt like I was talking more to an integrated group and more to a mainstream group. So I was focusing more on what the mainstream can do, which is that you have to learn to accept us as equal partners, but you also have to figure out how to help make our society create that equity so that we can be equitable, we can be equal members to you when we're in the co-ops, right?
Yeah.
And that's also why I kept talking about it's so important to think about community, right? Not just your co-op, but what is your co-op doing for the community? Because the community is ultimately, if we really want our movement to grow, the community is ultimately other co-ops and more people who would be co-operators, right? And if we don't participate in making the whole our communities better, we're not participating in making our whole movement better, right? So I think it's like, what is that? 3 prongs, right? So each group strengthen itself, right? Each group makes sure it's bringing community along and strengthening community, and then all of us coming together, either merging in integrated co-ops, or the co-ops might not be integrated, but they could all be in a federation, almost even like that's why I was using the Knights of Labor, more than 100 years ago. I mean, it's a weird model that the Blacks had to meet in different assembly house and have their own district, but in some ways that allowed them to, have their leadership and have their issues, and their issues could get merged equally with the other issues from the white groups, but they all work together on a common plan, right?
Right.
And then won, right? Because they weren't divided by the powers that be. They were strong together. They won, and then when they won, they were able to address all the issues.
Right. Over time, something that I've really that dynamic between institutions that are in, I'll put it in quotes, in power, and accepting more diverse, whether it's membership or in that dynamic of, well, they let them in and it's almost charity. It's almost those institutions in power, they really have to look at what they're trying to accomplish. If what they're trying to accomplish is to empower, to provide greater equity, then they need to understand that people that aren't necessarily part of the current cohort, that the other has so many assets. They're not maybe some traditional assets, but they're assets that are absolutely required to get to what the shared outcome, is viewed. And I think that's, that's an important mindset. So we have time for one more. We could go on all afternoon, Jessica, and again, everybody in the crowd will get to continue on this topic, although not with Jessica as our keynote at 1:30. But the last one, I love both examples. You talked about the Knights of Labor. The other one, what happened in North Carolina in the 1930s, and that those kind of three, a really deliberate effort at education, kind of up and down. The principle 6 on cooperatives come together across the state, and then really technical assistance too. I don't know if those are the words that you used. And I'll just mention, these are three things that we kicked off on Monday when we released the policy paper on how people can use co-ops to build more inclusive economies. Those are three of the key components, and can easily be found, and maybe somebody will put it in the chat room here. But that sort of formula and that example, I think is so important for us today. Where do you see the greatest opportunity? Where are some of those alliances or that intersectorality within the cooperative community where it could or should be happening that it's not quite happening yet?
Oh gosh, that's I didn't think I'd get stumped on that one. I think definitely, NCBA as our national, trade association is a good place to either be collecting or disseminating, or I guess maybe it's both, right? Collecting, creating, and disseminating that kind of information, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe helping to create toolboxes, toolkits, that kind of thing, right? In some ways, operating in the way that I guess in the North Carolina example, maybe NCBA CLUSA would be operating the way that the state ag department did, even though of course we would want the federal ag, but anyway, right, in terms of allowing different groups to make the materials that they need for their sector or for their audience, but then providing the resources and the dissemination so it got out more, and then including it in the technical assistance you have. It would be nice if the SBA also did that. I know, like in New York City, we finally got the New York City small business group to be doing co-op stuff, and I think we've been feeding them materials. So I think that kind of thing, right? We need the resources of the larger, either more public or more resourced overhead thing, but we need them to recognize that there's materials, assets, information from different groups that they could be using. I think that's probably the easiest way for me in 30 seconds to answer that question. But I think that's another thing that we should be looking at, because I do think, right, there is that whole issue of all the different federal enabling laws that we need. I know there's movement toward getting, right, more federal laws and federal resources. I'm really excited about the city movements that are trying to make sure we get municipal support and municipal money, right? I'm a group with some of the group, and we were talking about this earlier on reparations. I believe reparations money should go toward this kind of thing, helping create the materials, get the information out, and do non-extractive lending. So I think there's lots of roles for larger resource groups, but they've got to listen and use materials that are created from the smaller subgroups.
Yeah, but thank you for that. No, that's, I think as you pointed to in your presentation, and certainly here at NCBA CLUSA, we've been doing some of that, and we see that in a lot of the other sectors. But as I guess, one of the wrap-up points for this keynote is there's a lot more to do. There's some, as you pointed out, in the last 5 years, 30 years, there's been some great progress. But I think in 2020, that path towards more diversity, equity, and inclusion, and just how much farther we have to go has become, so much more clear. So thank you for helping us see that path, Jessica, as always. And it's just always a pleasure to spend time with you, and thank you for keynoting this session. A final note, everyone, there is a 1:30 town hall and panel conversation on DEI. Remember to take a look at your app, and it has some more information about how to engage. There's actually there's sort of a survey tool, a Menti tool that we're asking you to utilize at that time that's going to help inform the conversation. So everybody, have a great afternoon. We'll see you in a little bit. And thank you so much, Jessica. Take care.
Thank you, Jessica.
Okay, yeah, I wasn't sure when to get off.
Oh,
Okay,
that's okay. She'll let us know, and she will close the webinar when we're done. So
great.
thank you again, Jessica. That was great.
right.
You did wonderful. Nice work.
Thanks. Sorry I talked so long. I was trying to make it shorter, but anyway.
No, that's okay. It was great. It really was. Lots of super engagement in the chat, and we've got more questions coming in, so we'll try to get those over to you as soon as we can.
Okay, good. Do we know how many people listened?
Not yet.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Hey, it looks like
Oh,
about
yeah.
690, or there were 699 registrants, and a lot of the connections have dropped out, but I think we had probably over 500 people watching.
Great. Okay,
Excellent.
good. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Have a good day.